You know, I worked for a time at a hospital near my parents' house in Tacoma, Washington. I worked there as a chaplain. And one of the floors I worked on was the intensive care unit. The people there were pretty sick. Many patients on the floor couldn't really talk, so I spent a lot of my time comforting the families and the loved ones in those rooms. You know, there's a lot that a chaplain is doing that people don't even realize. As one example, one of the things chaplains do is to get more chairs when there aren't enough, and it's not only to be nice. The number of visitors who faint or fall in hospitals is more than you might think. Many people who are visiting someone in the intensive care unit, in fact, have also had traumatic days. They might not have eaten, they might not have been used to the amount of adrenaline coursing through their blood, gobbling up all their energy. So part of what chaplains do is to make sure that folks are sitting so that they avoid falling. And again, that's just one example. As a chaplain, I discovered there's a lot going on that people don't see. One afternoon, I was called to a room where the patient was very close to death. When I arrived, I saw my patient, an elderly woman with long white hair, lying in repose in her bed. And at her bedside was the elderly woman's daughter, holding a spoon and a styrofoam cup. The spoon had a small helping of soft serve ice cream on the end. And standing, not sitting, in the corner was the daughter's son. A man I guess was a little younger than I was at the time, in his mid to late 20s. There is a sense one gets when they enter a room where death is fast approaching. Those attending the dying gaze on their loved ones, not with intensity, not with expectancy, but with a kind of gaze that is so fully accepting and deeply human. It is a gaze that says, "Ah, yes, now I remember. This comes for us all." And it was under that twin gaze of a child and her own child that I pulled up a chair next to the woman sleeping in bed. I spoke at length with my patient's daughter, who explained that for the past few years, her mother, the woman sleeping, not eating her ice cream, had actually been living with her grandson, the young man standing in the corner, not sitting. And it was the grandson who took his grandmother to appointments. He helped her with her daily needs and kept her fed and healthy as much as he could. The woman I was speaking with, the grandson's mom, kept repeating, "A young man shouldn't have to do all that. A young man shouldn't have to do all that." And the silent grandson finally spoke up, "Mom, stop it. I don't care about that stuff. I love Grandma." And his mom let him say his piece and then said to me, "They've always had a special bond. He'd do anything for her." At this, the grandson thought of something conveniently he had to do with the car, and he left, not making any attempt to hide the tears streaming down his face. When he'd gone, the daughter told me some of the ways that her son had sacrificed so much of his life to care for his grandmother, whose recent decline had not been easy to manage. She also talked about her mom's wild days. She talked about the kind of guns that her mom liked and how she wouldn't take crap from anyone. And then the daughter also talked about how things weren't always great between them. Their strong personalities butting against each other made for some real fights. But she loved her and was happy her own son had had so much time to get to know her, even if he shouldn't have to be doing all those things as a young man. And then the woman in bed stirred. Her daughter was surprised because she thought she was waiting for her mother to slip from unconsciousness to death. And the patient opened her eyes and looked up. Her daughter tried to feed her ice cream, but no good. She tried the ice chips, but not having it. The woman in bed stared up, and her eyes were focused. Then she lifted her hand, and upon the faint line of her narrow lips, we saw the corners of what looked like a smile alight. And her hand kept rising. The corners of her eyes lifted too, and we were silent. As she grasped at something unseen, something not seemingly there, she reached out and she took it. And then she put her hand down again. The daughter looked right at me. Did you see that? I did see that. I had to wonder what it was that she was seeing, what it was that she was grasping. And only seconds later, the woman in bed unshackled from this mortal coil and died. And it was less than a minute later that the grandson returned. He was so sad he'd not been there for her passing. His own mother comforted him, holding his sobbing head against her heart, and said with certainty, "Sweetie, she didn't want you to be here to see that." Yeah, I learned a lot as a chaplain, that there's a lot going on that we don't see. I tell you this story because it's one of the truest stories about mothering I know. It's a story about what is said and what is unsaid, how mothers and children disagree, how mothering is not restricted by gender or age or generation. I tell you this story about recognizing mothers and mothering because on this day, we recognize the mothers in our own lives. Some of us are blessed enough to have mothers still who gave us life and also raised us. Others of us might recognize those who mothered us or who mother us still in our lives, providing care and comfort in times of need, trying to protect us from pain and uncertainty and grief. And still others have learned to be their own loving parent, their own mother, whether due to a loss of their own mother or the need to rebuild a broken or harmful relationship with a mother of birth. The ways that motherhood and mothering play out in our world, in our lives, even in just one hospital room on a summer afternoon in July for 3 people, differ wildly for each one of us, for all of us. The origins of Mother's Day are widely touted in Unitarian Universalist circles. This is because Julia Ward Howe, the great poet and abolitionist, in the latter part of the 19th century began the tradition of Mother's Day of Peace, when she called through a widely published proclamation for mothers to gather on this day, leaving the duties they were accustomed to performing for a day of counsel on the chance all mothers uniting together might have to bring about peace on earth, or at least peace in a broken nation. It was 1870 when this began, just a few years after the nation's Civil War ended, taking more than 500,000 of a nation's sons from their families. The goal of Mother's Day of Peace was to strategize ways to prevent such loss of life from ever happening again. But this original tradition didn't last long. In some places, it persisted a little, but not by much. And so it was in 1907 when a Methodist named Anna Jarvis made it her cause to have a permanent Mother's Day, and she followed through. Eventually, even the YMCA signed on, and then Woodrow Wilson made it a national holiday. And then Anna Jarvis watched. She watched her idea of Mother's Day come to be. And she had some comments about the traditions that had grown up around it already by the middle of the 20th century. Her words, "I wanted it to be a day of sentiment, not profit." In a history of this day available on the Unitarian Universalist Association website, you can read how Jarvis was, in quotes, opposed to the sale of flowers, but not the giving of homegrown blossoms. She also lamented the advent of the Mother's Day card. Her words, describing it as a poor excuse for the letter you are too lazy to write. She was a good old Methodist. Interestingly enough, Mother's Day is the most heavily attended Sunday in North American churches outside of the Christmas and Easter seasons. And in Unitarian Universalist congregations, the day has increasingly taken on a sense of being a day to mark the contributions of all women. So really, we can hear Mother's Day has had some problems, both in its original form and even in this later form. You might say it's had problems from birth. The idea that this day, one of the best attended days in U.S. churches, should remember the contributions of all women is a rich and powerful piece of juxtaposition. For really, in many of the religions most popular in the United States, the work of centuries of millennia to erase the contributions of women in the scriptures many study and many believe to be the word of, let's face it, a male God, forms some of the roots of the discomfort many of us here, many around the world, have with religious beliefs and their churches who peddle the ignorant, frankly, and impossible myth that women were not as much a part of history, part of faith, part of the founding of religious movements as everybody else, and in some cases, perhaps more so than men. Certainly, mothers are featured prominently in scriptures and texts of all kinds developed over the past few millennia, but many of the primal, earth-centered faiths of the world feature the power of the feminine much more prominently than the power of the masculine. The creative force of women to bring forth new life into the world is still as miraculous to me as just about anything. And I'm not alone. A friend of mine is a labor and delivery nurse at Kapiolani. And when I ask him what it's like, he says things like this: well, 2 people come into my room and 3 people go out. It's kind of like magic. Now, Mother's Day has some attributes that are a little funny too. In an article published in The Atlantic this past week, that venerable transcendentalist Unitarian publication that made Julia Ward Howe a household name, the author of this piece explained that a comprehensive study of what mothers really want for Mother's Day these days found that the most popular answer was time alone. Now, most mothers would not tell their loved ones this, depriving those who want to celebrate them of the celebration they plan. These moms don't want to rob their loved ones of pancakes and brunches and visits like this one many are having to church. I know plenty of moms want to do these things, and I also know that this is not the only thing that mothers keep to themselves. Anyone with the great honor to be at bedsides of those in the hospital can attest to this. The moment the children of a mom leave the hospital room, that mom changes. They may not always show it, but it happens. See, when a mother's children are in the room, many times they can't help it. They are taking care of their children even when they are suffering themselves. It's only when the children leave the room that some parents, and no offense dads, but it is more pronounced in mothers, will share what it is that they're really worried about. I had so many conversations with mothers who regretted things, the way they raised their children sometimes, who wonder with me what life might be like without children, who also loved and cared not only for their own children, but so many more of the children of the world they'd known in their lives, but not a one would give up the chance they had to be mothers. I learned so much about being a mother and what it really takes to do that from these times that children left the room, like the grandson checking on something in his car. In fact, it was after a few months in the hospital and living with my own parents at the time that one day I said to my parents, it is entirely unfair what this culture asks of, expects of, demands of mothers. It's impossible to do what our culture asks, and it's causing real pain for people. I said this like no one else had ever thought of it. I don't remember exactly what my own mother said, honestly. I could still use some work on listening better, I guess, but the best I can recall is she simply and plainly agreed with me. Now, I know how it might feel for some of us to be listening to stories about mothers who are in hospitals. I hope that I'm not upsetting people unnecessarily, and I know that many of us are grieving the loss of mothers in different ways. But from its birth, Mother's Day was meant to relieve the suffering of death brought on by war. It was meant as a revolution against the machine of war. And we understand that clarity in our own lives, for it is only when we are contemplating the quick of life, the coursing of the stream in each of us, that we remember we are marked, each of us, for an end to the quickness, a terminus to the course. We are marked from birth, and it is only by this mark, this birthmark we each carry, that the value of life is felt. And each one of us received this mark of mortality from a mother. And as a Unitarian Universalist, I can't help but notice things that unite us. I can't help but notice things that are universal for us, and birth to a mother is one of those things. Now, how we are mothered and how we mother others are about the least uniting and universal things on earth. The diverging paths of so many of our upbringings wind through lives from the idyllic and adventuresome to the painful, if not sometimes tragic, and I know the pain of some of these experiences. But I can't help but wonder whether part of the pain and even part of the idyllic experiences come from those same expectations that lead some mothers secretly to pine for some time alone on Mother's Day, that led Anna Jarvis to preach against the purchase rather than the growing of flowers and the use of greeting cards over a handwritten personal letter of gratitude. I can't help but wonder whether these same expectations follow us each for our entire lives, all the way from birth to the bedside of a hospital where a young chaplain does his best to understand what we are saying. Are we asking too much for too long of too many? Did you see that? She asked. After a hand reached for something that wasn't there. Was she reaching for something impossible to comprehend for human minds, human hearts? Was she grasping at last something so elusive that she only saw it, only then knew it? Or was she holding at long last the bright, kind hand of the mother that is with each of us, the mother that guides us, the mother of the universe that some call goddess or even God? Was a child taking a hand to cross the final thoroughfare of the material world? I don't know. It's a mystery to us all to this day. But I have seen, I have felt, and I have wondered with great awe at the mothers of this church, who, regardless of your gender, your age, or capabilities, regularly tend to, care for, lift up all the rest of this community. I've wondered with great awe at the mothers of this church who do not hesitate to lend time, attention, care, and support to a community unlike any other on this island. I have wondered with great awe, friends, at the mothers of this church who seem to grasp and hold that which is unseen, that which is unknowable, and guide this community to better and better things, to mornings of compassion, to days of justice, and to evenings of joy. So to each of you, to the mothers of our church, the mothers of this church, to mothers and those who mother everywhere, to all of you, and to my own mother, who is quite literally my hero, bless you, thank you, I love you, and amen.